I'm pleased to introduce Tim Pickett and J.D. Lauritzen, who will present today on understanding medical cannabis and current Utah laws. Tim Pickett is a qualified medical provider, business owner, educator, and advocate for medical cannabis. As the founder of UtahMarijuana.org and Utah Therapeutic Health Center, a network of 6 full-service cannabis evaluation medical clinics across Utah, Pickett leads the largest team of specialized medical marijuana clinicians in the state. Pickett's in-clinic patient visits fuel his dedication to accessible education and political advocacy for medical cannabis. He works with the state legislatures to encourage smart regulation and increase patient access, and educates medical professionals on safe and effective medicinal uses of cannabis. He is the voice behind the Discover Marijuana educational YouTube video series and the Utah in the Weeds podcast, as well as a sought-after lecturer on medical cannabis. J.D. Lauritzen, aka the Leafy Lawyer, is the head of legal compliance and government affairs for Wholesome Co. Inc., one of Utah's 4 vertically integrated medical cannabis companies. Prior to joining Wholesome Co., J.D. worked in private practice for Christensen & Jensen, where he focused on, among other things, servicing Utah's burgeoning cannabis industry and its patients. Before that, he worked for a small boutique law firm that specialized in civil rights, personal injury, medical malpractice, and products liability. J.D. graduated with distinction from University of Nebraska College of Law. He is a co-founder and current co-chair of Utah's Cannabis Law section within the Utah State Bar. Now turn the time over to Tim and J.D. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about understanding really the medical cannabis program, a little bit of the history, and what it takes to become a patient. We're going to go through a little bit of some of the questions that we think that have been presented to us really about testing and compliance, and then talk a little bit about misuse as well. And we'll summarize really with parents, children, and some what we think is best practice guidelines for parenting and managing like medical cannabis. So as we were introduced, I'm Tim Pickett. I founded UtahMarijuana.org and run a series of 6 clinics across the state. Utah Therapeutic Health Center is the name of those clinics. We take care of a significant number of the patients who need to use medical marijuana or medical cannabis in Utah. And JD, who's a friend of mine and really somebody who is an expert in Utah law and the history of cannabis law in the country and specifically here, I think is going to give a really good insight to some of the legal things that we run into and that you'll run into. So I'll kind of turn the time over to JD for really this section of the lecture.
Yeah, appreciate it, Tim. As Tim said, my name is J.D. Lauritzen. I'm the head of legal compliance and government affairs for Wholesome Co. Inc., one of Utah's medical cannabis companies. I'm really excited to get to present to you folks today. It's been a little while it's been a few months since I've been in private practice, and have been really enjoying my role, kind of general counsel plus role for Wholesome Co. So I guess without further ado, what I'd really like to do to start with is just kind of go through a brief history of cannabis. Cannabis dates back over 12,000 years, making it one of humanity's oldest cultivated crops. In fact, it's been carried by human beings to all corners of the earth, and the plant itself has adapted to different cultures, different environments, and so they have what they call landrace strains that exist all across the world. It originated on the steppes of Central Asia. Think, Mongolia or southern Siberia. For thousands of years, cannabis was used, as I've alluded to, by numerous cultures around the world as both a medicine and for industrial purposes. So it's only been in more recent times, since the early 1900s, that the views towards cannabis have changed. So in the early 19 teens, Utah was actually one of the first states to outlaw cannabis. And that kind of started, there was kind of a domino effect where many states were passing laws, poison control laws, and other laws aimed at certain substances, whether it be cannabis or other illicit substances. And it really culminated in 1937 with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act. And really what that did is it imposed a prohibitive excise tax on all cannabis sales, and effectively made cannabis illegal, although it was really just made subject to a tax, but no one could afford to pay the excise tax. A few decades later, in 1970, and actually before I get to that, I should say, if any of you are interested in understanding how cannabis became illegal, you can really study the history of Harry J. Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1937 and before. So we do fast forward a couple of decades, you get to 1970, as part of more kind of comprehensive drug reform in our country. The Controlled Substances Act was passed, classifying cannabis as a Schedule I controlled substance. It remains a controlled substance, or a Schedule I substance, to this day, despite many challenges to have it rescheduled or descheduled. It has remained as such. As the 1970s progressed, there was a movement for decriminalization around the country. Several states decriminalized, but then eventually the 1980s were ushered in, and the Just Say No to Drugs campaign, really took hold, and any decriminalization efforts that were made in the 1970s were kind of rolled back. Go forward to 1996, and California became the first state with the passage of Proposition 215 to usher in medical cannabis. And since that time, now 18 states and the District of Columbia have legalized adult use cannabis, while 36 states and DC authorized the use of medical cannabis. So it's safe to say that a majority of the country is living in places where there is either medical cannabis or adult use. In fact, 91% of Americans support medicinal use, and I believe for adult use, it's over 60%. So it's definitely a tide that has risen, a lot since 1996, and even more so since 1937 and 1970. So let's talk a little bit about Utah and how medical cannabis came to be here. So in 2018, the voters passed Proposition 2, which would legalize medical cannabis use in Utah. However, before the law could take effect, the Utah legislature took Prop 2 up and passed what eventually would be known as the Compromise, House Bill 3001. It did do away with many of the things that were in Prop 2, many of the things that voters voted for, and there's definitely been a lot of dialogue about that, about the will of the voters in relation to Prop 2, as well as other propositions. However, since the passage of HB 3001, the legislature has shown the willingness to continue working on Utah's cannabis laws and to continue to better those laws for patients, providers, and other folks, industry and things like that. So they held another special session in September 2019, and they've passed other amendments during the last two legislative sessions in 2020 and 2021. So this kind of shows you a little bit of the timeline. As it shows that 53% of Utah voters approved of the passage of Proposition 2. There were modifications made in 2018 with HB 3001 in December. Then the bill went into effect. 2019, they held a special session, and there were some changes made there. February of 2020, the sessions in 2020 and 2021 made changes, but also in February of 2020, flower could be sold and providers can start seeing patients. And that really was March 1st of 2020 is when the program was kicked off. So since that time, there are over, I believe now over, but like right around 35,000 patients, a number of medical providers. There are 8 cultivators. There are 14, soon to be 15 pharmacies located across the state, and there are a number of standalone processors that make, you know, other products beyond the unprocessed flower. So at this point, I think it is safe to say that Utah's medical cannabis program has definitely gotten off the ground and is in a really healthy spot, and even further along than I think a lot of people predicted at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. So really at this point, you know, we start talking about the why. So why is this something that we're talking about now? Why is this even an issue? And that really goes back to this opioid crisis. And that specifically, I think in Utah is something that we were concerned about as a public. And for example, in 2019, 49,000 people, almost 50,000 people in the US died of opioid related deaths, which is, it's just a massive number of people that are still having trouble despite huge national campaigns and huge campaigns in the medical field to really reduce the amount of opioids and benzodiazepines specifically that patients are prescribed, because they really are they're addictive and they're so dangerous. But in 2019, to contrast the opioid epidemic and the opioid deaths, not one single person died of a cannabis overdose. So that's really what is important to me as far as how come I got involved in this. And that is just, I think, taking it seriously that if nobody dies and it's a relatively safe alternative to some of these other medications we're prescribing, that we should take it seriously as a medicine. Of note, about 9% of chronic cannabis users will become dependent on cannabis. And that is about the same rate of addiction that opioids have as well. The difference is the death, right? The withdrawal symptoms and the physiologic consequences of opioid use and benzodiazepine use are just dramatically different than that of cannabis use. In Utah specifically, with my patients, and we've seen thousands of patients, 73% of our patients reduce the use of other medications after starting medical cannabis use. So one of the things that JD and I really want to present is the idea that cannabis can be an exit drug from other medications. And so if people are using fewer prescription medications, then that may actually be a benefit to the patients of Utah, to the parents of Utah. So let's go through what it takes to become a medical cannabis patient in Utah specifically, and then we'll understand a little better about the program.
No, I love that. And I've got like a whole bunch of that kind of stuff at my house, like a little
So medical cannabis cards can only be obtained through a qualified medical provider. Qualified medical providers like myself, we have to be registered with the state of Utah, and that requires some education. These cards can be used at any pharmacy once a patient has them. They can be used to purchase medical cannabis in one pharmacy. If they didn't have the product, a patient could then drive to another pharmacy and buy additional product. All of this data and all of this information is housed in the Department of Health's electronic verification system, where you can verify cards through the Department of Health or through the patient's qualified medical provider. You have to be a Utah resident in order to qualify for a card. You have to have one of 15 medical conditions in Utah, pain being by far the most common, and I'll show you a slide here in a second about that. You have to apply with the EVS system, with the Department of Health, and meet face to face with somebody like myself who's a qualified medical provider. It can be doctors, PAs, or nurse practitioners. You have to have a controlled substance license, a license to prescribe controlled substances in Utah in order to write these recommendations. I believe this is
If you want the video to show, we'll have to pop out of sharing and optimize it to show videos and then go back up to it.
it's totally fine. That video is really just a little clip. And I show that video, and we have hundreds of those, but I show that really because these people are not necessarily outside of our communities. I want to make sure that everybody understands that a lot of these people are really just within our communities. These are likely your neighbors, your friends. We probably all know somebody who is using medical cannabis. So as of July, there were 33,000 patients. Now that number, like JD said, is closer to 35. It's actually about 37,000 legal cannabis users in Utah. Most states will go at, towards a 3% of the population. So we anticipate that number will grow to roughly 100,000 before, slowing down essentially. So this is the breakdown of what people are using cannabis for in Utah, primarily chronic pain. That's by far and away the most. The mental health disorder that people can qualify for is PTSD. Just know that anxiety and depression, while they're very common to use cannabis, they are not qualifying conditions in Utah, and only these 15 qualify. So when a patient comes and meets with us, they'll meet with us on day one. The Department of Health takes about 3 to 14 days to issue that card. We then check in with that patient at 90 days based on the statute requirement. And then we have a follow-up visit 6 months beyond that. So 9 months total. We see the patient again. And then an additional 6 months goes by. So a total of 15 months at the point where the patient can then be qualified for an annual card, a once a year visit. Now, most providers are going to adjust that based on the patient's condition and what they need to see the patient for additionally. These are just the requirements for the card itself. So I thought it would be interesting for you all to know of the patient card holder ages. There are, if you look at this table, this is from that July report. Most of the patients are over 21. The bulk of the patients are between actually 25 and 55. There are quite a number of patients that are older than 71. Almost 2,000 there. And there are very, very few patients that are under 21 comparatively that have cards. Now, you should know that patients under 21 years old or those with a condition that is not listed, those must petition a board called the Compassionate Use Board. And the process of that is pretty extensive. There's a board of 7 physicians who evaluate each on a case-by-case basis and allow that recommendation to go through. Caregiver cards, each person that is under 18, or anybody who cannot care for themselves or cannot administer cannabis to themselves, can get a caregiver card. So somebody can apply for a caregiver card, go purchase the medical cannabis for a patient, and then help administer the patient medication. That requires a background check. It's a $65, I think, charge to the state, and they have to register with the EVS system, the electronic verification system as well. So that is how young children would get access to medical cannabis. This is I would say, it's a very extensive process, like I mentioned, and it requires a big application and a lot of communication between multiple providers at that point. So let's talk a little bit about how patients can legally consume cannabis in Utah. These are I like to show these types of graphics because this is the type of graphics that patients are going to see. And it makes a lot of sense to use the same things that the patients are seeing. So you can use, I believe there are 7, if you want to count them, different methods of consumption. So vaporized oil is an immediate release product. It's very common. It's in fact the most common form that is purchased. Edibles, or what we call gelatinous cubes in Utah, are allowed. Tinctures and oil sprays or sublingual drops. That just comes in a little bottle of oil. Topical creams, balms are also pretty common, and then flower vaporization. So you can buy raw cannabis flower in Utah. That is legal. You do not have to have them in blister packs. And that flower can then be ground and used in a product like this. So Utah is what we call a no flame state. So you cannot light a joint, you can't put it in a pipe and consume it in that way. And the reason that is the case from a medical standpoint is that you're combusting the plant material, and that combusted plant material is going in the lungs. So we don't want that for patients. It is healthier to use a vaporizing device like this Firefly picture shown. That is essentially a battery-powered pipe that keeps the temperature down into a range that creates a vapor that is inhaled, but it is not combusted. In addition, you cannot sell candies or baked goods in Utah. So while patients, and I think JD will talk about this in a second, there is some, JD, in fact, there's a little gray area on whether or not you can make these things on your own, but you certainly cannot purchase them at the medical cannabis pharmacies.
Yeah, that's correct, Tim. That you can't purchase them here. What you do with the flower once you're inside your own home, if you want to create some of your own home baked goods and different things, that's up to you what you do in the privacy of your own home.
So when we talk about limits that you can have, this picture shows approximately 4 ounces of cannabis flower, raw cannabis flower. That's the state maximum. So you can have in your possession up to 4 ounces of raw cannabis flower plus 20 total grams of THC concentrates. Now 20 total grams is 20,000 milligrams. So that would be 20, 1 gram vaporized cartridges. That's a significant quantity. By far and away, most patients are going to only use a fraction of this. Just as kind of an interesting, I think that it's interesting to note, I think the average transaction cost is about $135 to $150. Most of my patients are using between $150 and $300 a month of medical cannabis. All of this has to go through the electronic verification system. The patients are not allowed to purchase over the limit that I prescribe or I recommend, or over the limit that the state has set, which is that 4 ounces. And that is well tracked and well controlled. So let's talk a little bit.
Before you go into this, I want to just note one quick thing. So patients can obtain their cannabis at the pharmacy itself. For instance, our pharmacy offers both, walk-in service as well as online purchasing, and you can come to the pharmacy and get that by coming into the pharmacy, and you can do either the walk-in or the online that way, or you can go through our drive-through. And then we are one of 2 pharmacies that actually offers home delivery, and we are currently offering free statewide delivery, either same day or future day, and hope to at some point offer almost on demand medical cannabis to be delivered to people's homes, which is really wonderful for a number of our patients who have ailments that don't allow them to get out from their home. And especially during COVID, we have so many immunocompromised patients that they can get home delivery. So it's one of the things we've really prided ourselves on. So there's multiple points of access for patients to get what it is that they need.
To add to that too, Utah has done a really great job of treating medical cannabis as any other medication, any other strong medication. And when it comes to like home delivery or being able to do the drive-through, we're essentially just trying to treat this like any other medication you would go to Walgreens for, any other controlled substance. And so there will be oftentimes when patients cannot get out of their home, like JD said, people will go do home visits for those patients as well, trying to get them access, because the alternatives of the opioids and the benzodiazepines alternatives are somewhat limited in safety profile. So one of the big things, and we're kind of right on schedule here as far as how fast we need to go through this, because there's a lot of material to really cover, and we can't obviously cover this whole program in an hour. But one of the big things that I think is important to your group is this testing, this, trying to get a handle on, what do I do with these parents or these consumers of cannabis? Like, how do we classify them? How do we say that they're using it appropriately or they're not using it appropriately? So I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about testing. So there are basically 5 different ways you can test for most any substance, but cannabis for sure. Breath measures use within 2 to 3 hours and is just not available almost at all. I've never seen myself a breathalyzer test for cannabis. I know they're in development, and I know there's some in testing. There are different states that are trying to test these process, but this is not widely available. And that is the only test that will measure cannabis use in the immediate term. Blood measures levels, but is about as accurate as urine and is so much more expensive that it's not used very often. Saliva is another good one for about 24 hours, but it's not used very often, not readily available. Urine is kind of the gold standard. And we're going to talk mostly about urine testing because that's really what most of us you're going to see most commonly. So this slide just shows the duration and like the detection window. So, and I forgot to mention hair. So hair, in the brown line will take quite a bit of time even to show up, but it's the thing that lasts the longest if you test hair. Again, just focusing on urine. Urine takes approximately 33 to 80 hours to show up. So it's usually not going to show up the day somebody consumes cannabis. So it is absolutely not a good test for if you are under the influence of cannabis or under the influence of THC. Urine testing has nothing to do with whether or not you're under the influence, because it takes a little while. However, it will stay in the system for usually 1 to 2 weeks, but it can take there's case reports of up to 70 to 90 days. Those are very, very rare. Primarily, it's 1 to 2 weeks. So why do we test? So I think some of the questions that we've always asked is, are we trying to determine illegal use? Are we trying to determine misuse? Are we trying to determine, parent safety and child safety, and how to determine impairment? Is really the metabolites of cannabis, of THC, is what we're testing for. So unlike alcohol and many other drugs, THC is highly fat soluble. So it's stored in the fatty tissue. So after being there, it's slowly released back into the rest of the body, and it takes a long time before it's eliminated. That's why drug tests can detect THC or its metabolites long after somebody is actually impaired, but not necessarily while they're impaired. Depending on the substance examined, we're testing for essentially an inactive metabolite that's eliminated at a rate that is going to vary for different reasons that we'll talk about. So all urine testing is testing this 11 delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. It's the metabolite from THC. That's what we're testing. And depending on the lab that you're using, there will be a cutoff. So a lot of employers will use a cutoff nowadays between 20 and 30 nanograms per milliliter, depending on what those rules are. And there are labs or employer rules that will not only ask for the result of a passed or fail, but they'll ask for the result of the amount of THC metabolite in the urine, so that they can see essentially whether or not there is any metabolite in the urine. So a lot of people have been fired or disciplined for having THC in their system, but here's a couple of things that we should know. So most of the research in testing relies on smoked cannabis studies, which may or may not be relevant in any like situation that JD would get involved in legal situations. And a positive test being variable, we've got to know what that variability is between 20 and 35 nanograms of THC. So about 35% of chronic consumers will be THC negative within 7 days of abstinence. And about 75% will be negative by the end of 2 weeks. But you can have a person that will be positive during the first 4 days of abstinence. You can also have a person that would be, let's say they stop consuming on day 1 and they're negative on day 7. They're below that cutoff. That same person can abstain for an additional week and yet come up positive in week 2, even though they've abstained, based on things like metabolism and hydration. So there is very good evidence that, and they can go right to these cases where somebody is negative at day 7, but positive at day 14, but they have not consumed cannabis in all 14 days, simply because that person's body habitus and that person's hydration and kidney function were such that they ended up above the limit in 2 weeks, which really is important in the misuse and the compliance standpoint, to know that you're essentially not testing for impairment. You're really just testing for the metabolite, and what you do with that information has to be essentially qualified based on this research. So essentially, testing can help determine if somebody has consumed THC in the past 2 weeks, but it can't determine the amount of consumption. It cannot determine the level of impairment at any given time, and it cannot determine whether the use was recreational or medical. I really put a lot of emphasis on not using testing as a basis for judgment or decision making in medical cannabis cases that I am involved in, because it's just so limiting in what it can tell you as far as that goes. So let's talk a little bit more about, and we'll take your questions at the end, about that specifically. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the rights and obligations of medical cannabis patients as it comes to medical cannabis in Utah.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate your comments about testing, because the presence of cannabis in someone's system on its own is not always indicative of whether someone is using it appropriately according to a doctor's recommendation, or, I guess as the term would go, using it off-label. It's not something that's easy to define, but as Utah has decided to treat it very similar to other controlled substances, I think you would look for the same things to determine, if someone was misusing cannabis, just as if they were misusing alcohol or some other type of, controlled substance. So turning to the rights and duties of medical cannabis patients in Utah, the Utah's medical cannabis laws have a lot of different duties and obligations that they impose on medical cannabis patients, but they also give medical cannabis patients rights as if they were using other controlled substances. So the first thing is all patients should be carrying their cards with them, especially if they are in possession and or transporting medical cannabis or a medical cannabis product or even a medical cannabis device. The same thing goes for those, that are guardians, medical cannabis guardians, parents, or those that are caregivers. Your card is kind of your documentation, or it is your documentation of your ability to possess medical cannabis purchased from dispensaries or pharmacies, here in Utah legally. So it's always a good idea to keep your card with you at all times. A rebuttable presumption exists that a medical cannabis card holder who is carrying their card and who possesses cannabis, a cannabis product, or a device, the cannabis and the cannabis product being in a medicinal dosage form, some of those forms that Tim talked about before, there is a rebuttable presumption that they possess that cannabis legally. So that means that there is no probable cause based solely on a cardholder's possession of cannabis in a medicinal dosage form, a product in a medicinal dosage form, or a medical cannabis device to believe that the cardholder is engaging in illegal activity. Now that just goes for possession, right? Obviously, if someone is in possession of medical cannabis and is stopped by law enforcement and shows signs of impairment, you can still get a cannabis DUI. Although they have done away with cannabis metabolite DUIs here in Utah, so long as you are following Utah's medical cannabis laws. And I think that was a really good thing that they did. The metabolite laws, for the reasons Tim talked about, I think don't really tell the whole story, especially where cannabis, unlike some other controlled substances, can stay in your system for a long period of time, even after use, and certainly long after it's been impairing. So if a law enforcement officer stops an individual who's in possession of cannabis, a cannabis product or a device, and the individual represents the patient or the cardholder represents to the law enforcement officer that they have a valid medical card, but they don't have their medical card on them at the time, law enforcement is able to use a driver's license without a warrant to access the what we call the EVS, or the electronic verification system, to determine whether the person is a valid medical cannabis card holder. Obviously, if they have their card with them, they can present that to law enforcement, and law enforcement would be able to use that to compare against the EVS if they want to. Once a law enforcement officer is able to validate a cardholder status, they may not arrest them or take them into the custody for the sole reason that they're in possession of cannabis, a cannabis product or a cannabis device. They may not seize the cannabis product, or medical cannabis device. And this is something that's been met with varying results out in the community. Many people have been cited and had their cannabis taken from them, and some people have pled guilty to offenses that they never should have been charged with because they haven't been able to afford counsel, or because they don't want to go through the hassle of the court system. So it is definitely a work in progress here in Utah on the law enforcement side. Okay, some additional things. When traveling or transporting your cannabis, you need to keep it in the original packaging. You definitely, for flour, it has to not only stay in the jar or the bag that you received it in, but it also has to stay inside an opaque bag that the pharmacy gives you. The same does go for products that you purchase, either vape cartridges or gelatinous cubes, when transporting them from the pharmacy to your home. So if you are going to be transporting cannabis outside of your home, it should certainly be in the original container, if it's flour or the gelatinous cubes, and it should then be inside of an opaque bag that you cannot see through, except in the event of a defined emergency medical condition. a medical cannabis patient card holder, a provisional patient card holder, or a non-resident patient may not use in public view, any medical cannabis or a cannabis product. Now, someone's backyard does not necessarily count as within public view. Certainly in your home, and there may be some other places that may qualify, but generally cannabis should be consumed by patients safely inside their own home, and of course kept out of reach of children, locked away. And some parents, as we'll talk about later, may choose to consume outside of, away from their children for safety reasons and for other reasons. There is, so like we've kind of been talking about, the use of medical cannabis in Utah by a patient, by a card holding patient, is really considered the equivalent of the authorized use of any other medication, that's used at the discretion of a physician. And it does not constitute the use of an illicit substance or otherwise disqualify an individual from needed medical care. Again, as we've been trying to say, Utah has really tried to go the extra mile to ensure that cannabis is treated the same way any other controlled substances here in the state of Utah. It impacts the ability to own firearms, especially when it comes to concealed weapons permits or to purchase from public sellers of firearms. There are licensing issues that may come up for patients, for instance, CDL or other federal licenses where cannabis remains federally illegal would impact someone's ability to have that license. One thing I can't stress enough, and we probably don't have enough time to talk about it here today, though, is really the incongruencies created by the fact that cannabis remains federally illegal, but legal on the state level. And I'm hopeful that by next year, Congress will do something about that and will decriminalize cannabis, remove it from the Controlled Substances Act completely, and find a way for states to determine on their own what level of cannabis, I guess, is right for their state. None, medical or adult use. And then one thing to understand here in Utah, there are protections, there are employment protections for those working for state and political subdivisions. However, there are not those same protections for private employers or private employees and or federal employees, and even for state workers. If the cannabis, a failed drug test in itself cannot lead to adverse employment action. However, if it is impacting your ability to do your job or otherwise, then yes, they can still terminate you just the same way they probably could for any other, any other substance. I really would like to see the changes for private employees. I really believe that what an employee does when they're off the clock, as long as it doesn't change their, their performance on their job, they should be allowed to consume it like any other substance. Okay, I'm going to hustle through these next couple because we really want to get to the questions. I've seen quite a bit of them. So QMPs have the ability to set a patient's dosage, restrict the forms of delivery, or revoke the card. They really are the gatekeeper for a patient's medical cannabis use. And as Tim said, patients are seen 4 times within the first 15 months of their use, and also could schedule an appointment with their QMP at any time to go over everything. The PMPs or the pharmacists at the pharmacies are also an integral part of this, and they work lockstep with QMPs as far as that goes. And it even says here, pharmacy medical providers can set dosing for the patient in some cases where a QMP has left that to the pharmacy medical provider. And then finally, we've kind of already talked about this. State employees have some workplace protections, while private employees and or federal employees don't. Also, there are no housing protections for medical cannabis patients in Utah. So they want to, patients and cardholders are going to really want to review their lease agreement with their landlord to determine what is and what isn't allowed.
Let's talk just a little bit. We've got 3 more slides and then we'll get to some questions. We're talking about best practices here. And like we've reiterated multiple times here, we and I believe that we should really just be treating cannabis like any other strong medication, like a Percocet or a benzodiazepine when it comes to our kids. We want to keep it away from children. I think that is pretty obvious. We do not want children around secondhand smoke specifically. Utah law and good medical practice does not want pregnant or breastfeeding women to be using medical cannabis. We don't want any cannabis mixed with alcohol or other illegal drugs as a best practice guideline. But we do want to talk about cannabis to the kids. Kids are extremely curious, and talking about the medications that we take and treating it again, just like another medication, is really the, we think that's the right way to go, because that will keep kids from illicit use when they are, when they're not really supposed to be using it. Back to this question of how to evaluate, patients, consumers, parents, really, is the cannabis use impairing social or occupational function? Are they using cannabis instead of meeting other obligations? Do they use it so much that it impairs their ability to do other things, or despite their knowing that it impairs their functioning? So that's how I treat every other medication that I'm providing and recommending to my patients. And that's essentially how I'm really viewing cannabis as a medicine. And so we've kind of run through the slides. I want to make sure that everybody knows at the end of this is how to get a hold of JD and I if you have specific questions, but really we can go right to some of those questions from you, and there's resources here. So
Yeah, Tim, I think Lori said she was just going to kind of go through the comments and read the questions.
Read
and
the
then
questions.
You and I decide who's
Excellent.
best to answer.
Perfect.
All right, so if you guys are ready, first one, understanding the importance and reasoning behind the use of medicinal cannabis. But what about the children that are exposed through the parents' use?
Yeah, good question. And, I can speak to that from a medical standpoint. Like I say, I think if I'm comparing the two, the Percocet or the heavy use alcohol to the medical cannabis, I'm going to say, as long as that parent is responsible and they're meeting their obligations from a parenting standpoint, then I'm a supporter of cannabis. In fact, if I can get a parent to use less of another strong medication, if that is the question, then I'm going to be on board for the cannabis use wholeheartedly, because of the negative physiologic effects of those other medications in comparison. The risk of a child overdose for opioids, I work in the emergency department still part-time, and the risk of an opioid overdose is death for a child. But the risk of finding the cannabis and consuming it it's a bad day, but it is not death. So in that case, I'm going to support the cannabis use. In the case of overuse and not meeting your obligations to your own child, then I think that really is where you guys come in, and that is a determination of the whole team. JD, do you have any other additions to
Yeah,
that?
I think it just really is this, and I know there's some questions about this later on, but it really is just treating medical cannabis just like any other substance. And there's actually sections in the law that require judges or commissioners, or in the case of child custody, to really consider it the same, so long as the use is legal, right? We're really trying to normalize the use of cannabis. And I know for some people that is a hard thing to understand, because for so long we've been taught about, the illegality of cannabis, and you've heard so much of the reefer madness and so many of the negatives. But we're really trying to allow people to use medical cannabis in a way that is responsible. And of course, we don't want it to impact the children. And if the parent's use is not in the best interest of the child, well, then it's just not, right? But there are a number of people that are using this absolutely responsibly and in a way that I believe is actually benefiting their children in terms of the parenting that they are able to do because of it. So that's all I would say.
All right, thank you. The next question, what about patients who have a card but do not obtain the cannabis through a tracked system?
So I think,
I can-
JD,
I-
you're better
I
off
can probably
answering
handle it.
that one.
Yeah, I think I can handle that one. That there was a period of time where patients could obtain their cannabis either out of state or otherwise not from a pharmacy. That time has passed. So patients do need to obtain their medical cannabis card and then use that card at one of the 14, soon to be 15 medical cannabis pharmacies in Utah. Any cannabis purchased outside of a pharmacy is illegal.
How about the cost compared to the illegal market, or prices in a different state? Is there competitive enough to put illegal sales out of business in our area?
I
No,
think that's
there's,
something that's going to be asked for a long time, right? You know, here, Utah, I can confidently say that Utah's prices for medical cannabis are on par with many states that are kind of in the same, you know, stage of the process, right? I think it's really unfair to compare the prices of Utah to, say, Oregon, where they have a mature adult use market that's been around for a number of years, or even to a state like Colorado, right? But in terms of medical prices, Utah is very much competitive. Now, where legalized cannabis is having a hard time being competitive is with the illicit market. Because they don't have the regulations to follow. They don't have the fees, the licensing fees. They don't have to pay for much of the equipment, right? They don't have any compliance to deal with. So you do have higher prices. But I can say that we have seen at our pharmacy, prices have really started to come down. And at some point, there will be enough of a supply, which is probably going to be sooner rather than later, that you'll see prices come down significantly. So the hope is eventually you will be able to compete with the illicit market. But right now, I'd be lying to you if I said that prices across the country are driving out the illicit market. The illicit market is still there. However, the illicit market runs a great risk for consumers to continue to consume from, you know, if they run into legal troubles or if they have parenting issues and some different things like that.
Great, thank you. Another one, we routinely become involved with families where abuse of legal substances negatively impacts parents' ability to safely and effectively parent their children. If testing is not effective in determining impairment, what other tools can be used to evaluate children's safety with parents who are consistent users of medical marijuana?
you know, I kind of hate to say this, but this is where society really turns to you all to make that determination. I think that it is, if we treat it just like every other medication or just like any other substance, is that parent meeting their obligations to their own health and their own safety and their own wellness, and to the child's obligations too. That's how I look at it from a health and wellness standpoint. Testing is, like we had talked about, not really an effective tool. Exposure to, you know, then it comes down to exposure to illegal activity. You know, are they using methods of consumption that are illegal or that are legal? Are they, like JD said too, I personally, this is really my bias because I take care of these people. I find that parents tend to be actually better parents when they're choosing cannabis over other medications. So working with that team approach for those parents becomes really, really important. I guess I don't have a definitive answer on how, you know, what tools are there to establish misuse. I know I'm involved as a consultant in a case where there is a concern for misuse and they're using this urine testing, and that just isn't the case. We as a society and as a group need to come up with better ways to evaluate that.
Certainly, and I think unless and until society is really willing to realize, and this may not be a popular opinion, but there are responsible drug users out there, and we believe that more often than not, cannabis users that are using it according to Utah's laws are very much responsible. And I've heard a number of anecdotal stories, you know, from patients, and I'm sure I could bring our pharmacists in to tell a bunch of them, but that their cannabis use, when used in, you know, to wean down other substances they're using, you know, including opioids, or to even replace those substances completely, has markedly improved their lives and has markedly improved the lives of their, you know, their families. That video that Tim was going to show was, you know, that he played, which didn't have audio, talks exactly about those types of things, what it does for their lives and those, you know, around them.
Thank you. This morning we heard a presentation about how much stronger and more concentrated modern THC is compared to in the past. How does this impact parents using medicinal marijuana now?
This is a good question, and I appreciate this question because it reinforces my argument that a medical program is stronger than an adult use program, especially now that the THC concentrations are higher. So by increasing the THC concentrations, you almost need a little more guidance from your pharmacist at the pharmacy, from the medical provider when you're starting these medications. It does make them more psychoactive, but for the vast majority of patients, they're simply using less of those products, and they're able to essentially spend less money to get the same effect than they were before. So it's not a completely negative thing that they're more concentrated or the a number of different types of products is available. I think that it's almost a benefit that they are getting a little stronger in some ways. We have patients that don't have to use smoked flower or vaporized flower. They can use an oral ingestion method. That's better for them because it avoids lung tissue damage. It's better for the kids because they don't have that secondhand smoke around and they can lock that product up. So I think it's a matter of perception and it's a matter of education. And we really need to educate patients to be able to use less. And again, lock that stuff up so that they're keeping it out of reach of kids so that the kids stay safe.
Yeah, as the adage goes, start low and go slow.
All right, thank you. I know we're running out of time. Can you guys describe how, as a prescriber or the recommendation, how do you track and know the dosage that your patients are taking?
This is a great question. So most providers in Utah and around the country don't know a lot about dosing medical cannabis. So it is really provider dependent, and providers can make a recommendation. And like I say, I put up the fence around the pasture and the patient can experiment within that pasture. So I'm going to set a purchasing limit for that patient, let's say 1 ounce of flour and some concentrate, and the patient can experiment. We want them to take control of their own health and use delivery methods that work for them, because cannabis is a little different than other medications in that regard. But we want to have those boundaries set up. Many providers will just allow the patients to have state maximum, and then the patient again is able to experiment within it. As far as being compliant with those recommendations, if the patient purchases or tries to purchase more than my recommendation, they'll get stopped at the pharmacy and then have to call me, and we'll have to talk about that. And that is how the system is set up, so that I can set up some guidelines. The patients can make those decisions on their own in consultation with the pharmacy. And then if they need to adjust those dosing, they come back to me and adjust that. So I have access to everything they purchase. I know exactly what they're using based on the electronic verification system. And that is really the state's compliance method.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is the pharmacy and the pharmacists that work here have access to the same information, right? So they are able to, ensure that the patients are getting the appropriate, what the doctors, what the QMPs have said they can get and not, and they are working to, to wean down and titrate, the dosage, right? I mean, it's much more exact than people might think. And each of the products, like if it's a gelatinous cube, it may have 10 milligrams of THC in each cube, or it may only have 5, and it may have some other cannabinoids, and really the patients, as Tim said, they kind of have a pasture that's, they kind of have a fence that's put around them, and they can experiment within that. Because one thing to understand is that cannabis is not likely going to kill anyone. As a matter of fact, as far as I'm concerned, there's never been a reported death due to cannabis consumption. Now, things that have happened while someone's been on cannabis, different story.
Okay, I have just 2 more questions. Legally, we're not supposed to smoke marijuana here in Utah, but at the same time, you take the flower back to your home. Is it then up to the person how they use it? And also, if they choose to smoke it around children, could they lose their medicinal cannabis card?
So I think that's an easy one to answer. Smoking is always outlawed, no matter where it is. Combusting cannabis is always outlawed. If you take your flower home and you decarboxylate it and then infuse it into foods or oils, or you make your own, gelatinous cubes, so to speak, that is what is okay. It's never okay to take it into your home and to combust it. And of course, if someone is breaking the law with their use, they can have their card renewed. Revoked. That's one of the reasons, is violating the Utah Medical Cannabis Act, along with committing a felony or catching a drug distribution charge. So yes, and obviously, if someone is smoking around their kid, they're not using it responsibly, and I think it would be a factor to go into determining whether that's in the best interest of the child.
And you can heat the flower up into the right temperature to activate those compounds in there, and then inhale that vapor, as similar to like baking. It's essentially baking the product. That's how you're inhaling it in Utah legally.
Thank you. Do all prescribing doctors go over the history of a patient's recovery prior to recommending the use of a medical cannabis?
So yes. So all prescribers, all qualified medical providers are by statute supposed to go through the medical history, supposed to establish a really strong relationship with that patient, a patient-provider relationship, and then take care of those patients through that process. There are varying levels of commitment in the space, certainly, as there are always various levels of commitment with every patient. So yes, we're supposed to go through their medical history, go through their medical records, if they have them, do a full evaluation and treatment, just as if they were coming to us because they're essentially coming to us for whatever condition, and we are treating their condition. We just happen to be using cannabis as another tool.
All right, great. I know I said only two more, but I have one more.
Go ahead.
When you prescribe medical cannabis, do you differentiate between whether they are using sativa, indica, or hybrid?
So that really comes down to a lot of these conversations happen around in the pharmacy itself, related to what types of products they're going to choose. So, and it is dependent on how much the provider knows and how much how much they're willing to share. So there are plenty of providers who don't know very much about cannabis, but think it's a reasonable alternative for the patient, and they'll send the patient to the pharmacy to have that consultation and that discussion. And yes, at the pharmacy, they're always going to discuss what type of cannabinoids. There's 120 cannabinoids that are in the plant, whether strong THC, the different types of THC. I'm going to have those conversations with my patients. I'm going to guide them towards one or the other, or a hybrid mix. We're going to set out those guidelines and then let the patient keep a journal on how they're using it to better their condition. So yes to all the above.
All right, well, we are out of time. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, JD. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Lori. Really appreciate you having us.